Welcome, dear front-end web developers, to the first Framsia meetup of the year 2021. My name is Maxim Salnikov, and I'm one of the organizers of this community, of this user group. It's the largest one in Norway dedicated to web front-end development. We are almost 3,000 members, I believe. And join us if you just joined YouTube stream. So be a part of our community. It's based in Norway, but it doesn't matter, right? All the events are digital now and for some period of time. And we definitely want to proceed with this kind of delivery. So to stay updated, please join our group on the meetup. You'll find it easily, meetup.com/Framsia. Or we also have Twitter, where you can follow all the updates and all the announcements about the next events. Okay, so about today's guest. I announced this time our guest as a mystery speaker and world famous one from the front-end web development universe, and especially from UX part of this. And I'm super happy to say that today on our virtual stage, my big friend, Vitaly Friedman. And it's my pleasure to invite him to our stream. Hello, Vitaly.
Hello, Maxim. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining in. Maxim, you look fabulous today. Like all the little stars in the back. You're like a king in your little castle. Is it your personal home castle, or is it just a random castle you happen to be in right now?
No, this is my personal home castle, and I moved in just a couple of weeks ago. So thanks for noticing this.
Yes, it looks really nice. I mean, I try my best over here as well with a few flowers and this and that. I'm just trying to set up something that looks nice and beautiful as well. Like we're all staying in home, so you better make best of it, I guess.
Awesome. I love that. We set sort of high standards in streaming, right?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, frankly, we can have a conversation about that later as well. But it's for me, it's been very interesting to see how the world has been changing, also in terms of online conferences and meetups and all. And while many people see it as a negative thing, I kind of see it as a very, very positive thing in some way. Because I get to attend meetups from India and Nicaragua and all kind of places, which I frankly never done before. So that's exciting. I mean, that's a separate conversation to have though.
And now you're in Norway, right? Virtually.
Yes, I almost feel like is it the snow, the coldness of the snow there?
Yes. Snowing? So, yes, you see it's snowing.
I can tell
behind my window. Yes,
I can tell right away. In general, though, I think first of all, thank you so much for a very kind introduction. But I mean, it's like I'm just a very humble person who sits mostly at the kitchen because we just moved to a new apartment. So I have a very small kitchen with a very small workspace because nothing is Germany is difficult in terms of lockdown. So it takes a while until tables and stuff get delivered. So I was really lucky that just a couple of days ago I had an actual table. This is incredible. Like having a table is very, very good. I think this is a very good investment of your time and effort and money as well. So that's super helpful. Camera is all old, but it's temporary, but still pretty much decent.
Yeah, but we see you well. We hear you perfectly well. So I believe our technical setup is excellent. So you are streaming from Germany, right?
Yes, that is
I'm
correct.
sitting here in Norway. Dear attendees, let's test our interaction possibilities. So I appreciate, and I bet Vitaly appreciates also, if you send us your questions using comments on YouTube Live. So let's test how that works to make sure that I didn't forget to enable comments. Let's start from simple questions. So please write or comment, where are you watching us from, just to check the geography of today's attendees. So I'm from Norway. Vitaly is streaming from Germany. Where are you folks? And
well, I think at this point we accept all kind of input, be it emoji, ASCII, text, plain text. Any other formats that you would be accepting in a chat window, Maxim?
Everything what's within code of conduct, I'd say. Yeah, and it's
reasonable.
Very important reminder, folks. Please let's be kind to each other, and we have publicly open comments today. So please, it's just follow the general rules of politeness and with each other. I see the core of our audience is from Norway. Some folks from Denmark. Maybe someone from other countries will join us also. So I tweeted about this event on my personal Twitter with pretty much around the world audience. We'll see. But obviously, since Framsia is based in Norway, was scaffolded in Norway. Yeah, of course, the core audience is from Norway. Yeah, folks. Before we start, we start our technical session in just 2 minutes. As I announced on the meetup, in addition to the excellent technical session from Vitaly, we have one more interesting piece of information to share with you.
What would that be? I'm very curious. Very curious.
Maybe you know the organization Vitaly is working for, and I believe he's one of co-founder of this organization called Smashing Magazine, which is, I believe, the most famous online magazine blog.
Just because we're so old, so that's the only reason, I think.
Yeah, I cannot use word legacy, right? Here it's very mature source of the information. So I really love articles you have there, both about design and very technical one. So I feel that Smashing Magazine is one of the best source for my favorite topic, progressive web apps and service workers. I really appreciate your long reads you have there. But it's not only online magazine. It also a great source of education for all front-end web devs, and I believe especially folks who are involved in building user experience for UX designers and UI designers, and they run really cool workshops. I'd say best-in-class workshops dedicated to how to prototype proper user interfaces. And our today's topic is also from this scope. But saying that, for our dear attendees, for members of Framsia Meetup, Smashing Magazine and personally Vitaly created very generous discount for 2 upcoming trainings on building navigation, and the second one, could you remind Vitaly what's this?
There is one that's coming up this Thursday actually, and we have 74 people signing up. It seems like it's going to be quite something, which is essentially about everything front-end 2021. So I was looking into everything that's been happening, and in terms of JavaScript, CSS, and performance and accessibility and everything in between. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time playing with all the new techniques and things to know. I mean, it's incredible just to think about the sheer amount of stuff that was coming out of the community last year. It was just unbelievable. But because we were busy with something else last year, many of those things kind of got hidden or so. So my goal is to kind of expose them. This is starting actually this Thursday in 2 days, and you also get a friendly discount. And the other one is a perfect navigation, which we're going to run in March. So if you need a bit of time to convince your manager, I'd be happy to convince your manager. I can be very convincing at times, and Maxim, I'm sure as well. But I'd love to see you all there.
Yes, folks. Stay with us. I'll share the link to this discount code and to events themselves right after Vitaly finished his session. I just want you to stay with us. And I can say, prices, even without discount, prices are very attractive. But with the discount for Framsia members, you can't resist this. And of course, these events are virtual. These events are during evening times, and these events are multi-day ones. So it's a real deep training. So it's not just blah blah blah. It's sit and build something together with Vitaly. So yeah, there are multi-days, but very friendly to your work schedule. But yeah, all the details right after Vitaly's session. Saying that, Vitaly, the stage is yours.
Excellent. I'm so
What
excited.
will you present us today?
I don't know. Maybe let's see in the chat what does everybody wants to actually. Oh, I actually was in Lillestrøm, I think, once. I think that Olive wrote that he's from Lillestrøm. This is exciting. Yeah, so I would like to dive into a topic that has been exciting me for years. And actually, last year I had an opportunity to spend a bit of time researching it and trying to figure out how we can do it better. And that is related to web forms. Do you like web forms, Maxim?
I love web forms. I'm pretty much sure that, let's say, average web application consists of web forms in this or that form.
For sure. Oh, that's a good one.
90%, right? So if you master forms, you master web development, web front-end development, at least.
Yeah,
yes,
so,
I can't wait. Vitaly, start your first slide. When I see this, I immediately share your screen. Yes,
I think I do.
I add in this. Yes, so we now see your screen, and I disappear to give you full control, full focus. And yeah, take your time, 30, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, up to you. You are flexible. You are the only speaker today, so rock on.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maxim. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me. This is all a very temporary setup for me, but I'm trying my best to not disappoint you, dear friends. I would love to see all of you in kind of even if it's little rectangles, maybe. But I'm sure we'll catch up next time as well. Now, I would like to speak about forms. I know that forms get a very strange reputation. I don't think that anybody wakes up in the morning hoping to finally fill in a form that day. I mean, I do get this kind of strange excitement, I guess, about beautiful buttons, the radio buttons and checkboxes and mega dropdowns at times, and even sliders and toggles. There are so many of those that could be integrated well to kind of make the experience great. Unfortunately, most of the time, this is not the case. And so what I really tried to kind of understand last year is how can I tell reliably to my colleagues, to my friends, to the companies I'm working with as a consultant and so on and so forth, how can I tell if a form is well designed or not? How can we measure if it's well designed or not? How can we design one that's definitely going to work or not? So in this session, in the next 40 minutes or so, I want to kind of highlight some of the guidelines that I'm following, that I try to follow at least based on the usability research and based on the plenty of testing that's been done, usability testing that's been done out there, of what would make a good form. And so when we look into forms, again, it's probably important to understand that forms are not just those things that we tend to think of when it comes to checkouts or maybe something that's filling in a form like signing up for an account or things like that. Forms are actually much bigger than that because they also involve pretty much anything that we're going to design. And they're not coming out of nowhere. There is a very good reason why we ended up with the forms as they are designed today. And the reason is actually quite simple. When we look into those things that are coming from the past with all the paper forms that we had to fill in back in 60s and 70s and 80s, it's actually not surprising that many of them are almost one-to-one mapped to online experiences as well. And so we have this, drop-downs for Mr., Miss, and Mrs. and so on. We have last name and first name, and have different width for different input types, right? And then we also have some sort of pre-formatting and email address and other things. Well, this is not from 60s, obviously, but it could be. And then look at this, a magnificent, huge button, probably one of the biggest buttons out there. Right, and when I look at this form, it actually reminds me of everything that we're designing on the web today as well. Because forms are everywhere. It doesn't matter what you're designing, what you're building, if it's a small, a big corporate website or a small mini site, landing page or so, you'll have to deal with things like signups and checkouts and search and filtering and newsletters, configurators and wizards and services, application forms, authentication, onboarding, editing, data, input, table, messaging, and so on and so forth, right? So all of this requires some sort of input. And whenever some input is required, we're probably going to use one form, right? Unfortunately, those forms usually don't look very cool right? They look very, very boring, exhausting, almost boring, how boring they are. So when we look at this one, like, you just have one page and you have asterisk next to the, the whatever you are supposed to type in, and then you type it in, and that's not fun. But I actually wondered, like, how come, and that's really interesting, how come that we're used to the fact that we're being asked to repeat or confirm our email address and also password, but we never asked to confirm, first name or last name. Is first name and last name, or are they less important than password on email? That's surprising to me, if you ask me. But in the end, also, sometimes we use asterisks, sometimes we use optional in brackets. So what should we do? Right? We'll talk about it a little bit later as well. Now, all those kind of minor things that kind of make the experience, right? On the other hand, we also have this, again, verification, repeat email address, repeat password, but we never kind of repeat last name or first name. Why is that? Sometimes we end up with very, very strange forms, like this one, where whenever you were applying for the UK visa to go to the UK, if you happen to be from a non-European country, you would need to type in what country you're coming from, and they had options for European countries, and they also had options for non-European countries, which was conveniently called other passports. So if you happen to be outside of the European Union, you would be other passport. Thank you very much. That was very, very kind. One thing that's kind of weird here, though, is that in that form, you are supposed to enter all characters exactly as they appear on your ID, including letters, numbers, and bracket symbols. And indeed, if you want to actually make it work, you have to type it all in here, indeed, right? This is just a little bit too much, if you ask me. And sometimes these forms are not just, stupid, sometimes they're ridiculous. This is probably the weirdest one I've ever seen in my life, because what you're going to do here is add a newsletter sign up option to your shopping cart. Then you check out with the shopping cart. Luckily, this option is free. You check out with that option. In the checkout, type in your email address as you do. Then you're going to receive an email with the link that's going to drive you to the newsletter sign-up page, where you can retype your email address and then get another confirmation email via your email to confirm the correctness of your email that you already verified because you've checked out with that email anyway. Right? What is this? Right? How did we end up in this world? You want to go nastier? Let's go here. This is one of the other ones, which is a little bit weird, if you ask me, where you are filling in a form for an insurance, right? So you're building up your own insurance plan. So as you do in Germany, there are a couple of questions that are being asked. One of them is, when is your birthday? Well, if this is the right input for this is a different story. We'll talk about it a bit later. But then also, do you have children, right? With the user interface being a slider with an input, I guess, and a pencil icon. This is a little bit strange, maybe, because most of the time, always, sliders have a minimum value and a maximum value. And minimum value, luckily, is 0. But what should be the maximum value? How many children are you allowed to have? And why do developers have to decide it? Now, luckily, they decided that the maximum should be 10. Unfortunately, if you have more than 10, there is a way out. There is a way out, because you can click on the pencil icon, and then this input field will show up. And then you can type 11 if you do have 11, right? Or if you're planning to have 11, right? But then the interface will tell you, because the interface always knows better. No. You have 10. You can have at most 10 children, right? This is slightly weird. And then sometimes it just gets a little bit frustrating and annoying. Can you tell me, maybe in the chat so I can read later, what does this mean? Do you understand this interface at all? Like, what does this stand for? Is it like some sort of Sudoku game that we're playing when it comes to an e-commerce filters experience? And in fact, this is what it looks like then on mobile in actual on the actual site, right? Where you have a lot of options and you have a lot of filters, and next to them there are labels, but there are plenty of them. So maybe actually being able to break it down somehow in a more reasonable, to have a kind of a more reasonable access to the sizes would be a bit better, right? So not to say that all forms are like that. Some forms are worse, because we also have this beauty around, right? I mean, we don't really have CAPTCHA anymore. We like to make fun of CAPTCHA, but we don't really have CAPTCHA anymore. We have the new, renewed CAPTCHA that came as, Phoenix came from the rising, has arisen from the ashes, in the form of the crosswalks and traffic lights, because who doesn't like them? Right? This is fun, right? You go ahead and you just pick all the crosswalks and you pick all the traffic lights, and then you'll be just happy, right? And this is again the kind of the world in which we're living. And the final example I want to show, because I really hate the company, is of course Ryanair, because I'm like an elephant. I never forget. Because when I was buying a ticket with Ryanair back in the day when they had an old design, you always had insurance added in for you automatically, unless you opt out. But to opt out, you need to know how to opt out, because to opt out, you need to find, don't insure me conveniently located between Denmark, hello everybody from Denmark, and Finland, right? This is just mean. I mean, this is just really, really, really mean. This is not how it should be. So in 2020, I was teaching at university in Amsterdam, and I had an incredible opportunity to actually talk to students about the web. I really wanted to know, do they like the web? I mean, I grew up with the web, and I remember the times when the web didn't exist. I think that some of you might remember this time as well. So I remember vividly how different the world and my life has become once the web has become a thing, right? And it was very exciting. I was really, really happy about this as well. And what I found really, really surprising is that this excitement is totally not there in the young generation. First of all, they grew up with the web. They don't know what it's like without it. But on the other hand, they're extremely frustrated by the web. And most of the time because of forms. Why? Well, because we have things like this all over. Whenever it comes to e-commerce filters, for example, there are these tiny scrollable panes for brands, let's say, where you have like hundreds of brands and you have to select them very carefully, especially on mobile device. This is no fun. Tiny click targets, right, for newsletter checkboxes. Frustrating and annoying. Unexpected content shifts and page reloads, right? Select dropdowns that, of course, just happen to be a huge select dropdown with 292 countries, and you know where to find yours. Generic error messages that don't really help, don't really guide the customer to the actual resolution of that error. Input that's fully cleared on error, very common when you actually type in the credit card data, then you realize you have to change the address because there was a mistake. You go back to changing the address, and then you want to move forward, and then you have to retype this complex input again because the input is fully cleared. Disabled next buttons, unsupported back buttons, disabled copy paste, no text input fallback and sliders, because usually they're very, very difficult to navigate. Draconian, I'm very proud of this, draconian password requirements. And this is very, very typical that we have a couple of passwords that we use for predictable services like e-commerce sites. So if you need to create a new e-commerce account on an e-commerce site, you're probably going to reuse some of the passwords just because you actually want to be able to log in comfortably on mobile and on desktop and on tablet without having to sync. Many people do that, right? So what people do is, whenever we encourage them to create a really, really safe and really, really long password, they reuse the password that they were using in the first place, or they're using most of the time, and then they add these extra characters that are used only to pass the gates, right? Please write in the chat if you do that as well. I'm just curious, right? And so all these things, right, are connected to forms. The best one, we're also very proud of this, is a birthday picker that starts at 2020 or 2021, right? The good question to ask could be, what would be the right input to start with, but probably not the year when you actually are typing in that data, right? And then, of course, scrolljacking parallax and identifying buses and crosswalks. So with this in mind, what I want to kind of look into, what would be the better way, right? Because it's not like forms are horrible. We just need to make them a little bit better. And for that, we kind of need to look first into how people perceive forms. How do they understand forms? What are they like? And what do people like about forms, right? And that brings us kind of to a very simple question. So how do we perceive web forms and input altogether? Specifically, if we look into something like this, right, where you're going to type in, hello to Oslo, when you're going to type in when you're going to go somewhere, right? The selection of the date, is this a bad design or is it a good design? How can you tell? I mean, many of us will tell, oh, this is horrible, this is slow, this is uncomfortable, why would you do that? But how can you objectively say that this is a good design or this is a bad design? Because design is kind of inherently subjective. So how can we make it a bit more objective? Oh, we need to think about time, right? How much time does it take to fill in that form? Or we need to think about the convenience, right? How many taps or clicks are required to actually fill in that form as well? So this might seem like a pretty bad idea. Okay, let's take a look at the other ones. What about this one? I'm sure that some of you might have seen this because it's actually coming as default date picker on Chrome, right? You might wonder, really, is it the thing? And can you guess, like, what is the big problem here? Is there a problem, or is it just a regular good input or way of inputting data for something like date of birth? If my date of birth is 8th of February 1985, which is true, what would be the fastest way to type it in? Would it be using a widget and multiple levels to go out of the day, then to go into the month view, then to go into the year view, then to jump to another year, and then go back into the month view, and then to go back into the day view? It's probably going to be a little bit slower than just, typing it. So if I had an input field where I could type in my date of birth, that'd probably be easier, right? Or at least we could have a combination of a date widget, right, like this, with an input, which is not supported here. So in fact, this design is not keyboard accessible, and it actually slows down more than it actually helps. And it's really interesting because when we look into those things, right, we need to really figure out how do people see those forms, right? So if you think about typing in data of like birth date, you now think about, okay, let me go pick a year first, and then pick a month second, and then pick the date. We think about it as a string, right? We know what our birthday is because it's 8th of February 1995. This is it. So you would type 8th of February 1995. That's probably a little bit better and closer to the mental model that customers will have. The same goes to things like name. When I ask you for your name, you're unlikely to tell me my first name is this, my middle name is that, my grandfather's name is this, and my last name is this. You would just give your full name. However, our interfaces do not reflect that. Our interfaces are built pretty much with backends in mind. So it's easier on the backend to actually transform and save and store and retrieve this data later. The same goes for address. If I ask you for your address, you would never tell me my street is this, my building number is that, my apartment is this, my floor is this, my PO box is that, my zip code is this, and my city is this, and my country is Norway, right? It's not going to happen, right? Instead, you have your string in your mind because you know where you're living. So you're probably going to write my name, the address that you have being like Freiwilligenstraße 30, 64542, Düsseldorf, right? Which is where I am right now. Please don't call me just yet, right? So all these things need to be mapped. So that doesn't mean that we have to create really boring and predictable interfaces, because even an interface like this, which is also a date picker, could be reasonable. Do you understand how this works? Let's just think about it for a second. And let's play it again. Right. Basically, it's a date picker constructor where you click on buttons in order to construct your date. That would be, for example, 1956, September 27, right? This is kind of how it works. Probably wouldn't make much sense on an airline website or so, right? But it makes perfect sense for something like a public library, which is what it was designed for in New York, right? Because people are working with dashboards, and when they index books, it's much faster to index books by just tapping on buttons and constructing the date this way. So we can't just say that the design is good, the design is bad. It always lives in the context. So we kind of need to evaluate what makes it fast, right? Given the circumstances in which we are. And fast is very important, and speed is very important, because to evaluate a form, to kind of map into how people perceive it and tap into it, we need to maximize typing speed on mobile, on tablet, on desktop, and pretty much anywhere else. And for that requires a little bit of research. Now, this is a lot of data here, and I don't have a source, which I should add. I will add it after the talk. But essentially, what we know is that an average user types one character of an English word within 280 milliseconds. This sounds like slow, but on average, I think most of us in the IT world will be a little bit faster, but on average, this is what we should be expecting. However, if it's an obscure text, it doesn't have to be captured. It could also be a foreign language that you don't speak, for example, or just a random string of characters, right? You'll be 3 times slower on average, like 750 milliseconds at least. Also, whenever we force somebody to switch between a mouse and the keyboard, or trackpad and the keyboard, or switch between keyboards on mobile, it takes time, which we should not neglect. On average, it would need at least 400 milliseconds to switch between keyboard and mouse on a desktop. It would take even more time on desktop because you also on mobile, because you actually have to select the keyboard that you want to use. So if we're not providing the correct keyboard from the start on mobile, we're actually slowing down somebody massively, right? And so what it all means is whenever you have something like an 8-field address form, right, which you see at the bottom, right, we know, oh, let's me go back here. Here we go, right? So whenever we have something like an 8-field address form, we know for sure that typing is slow. Even if you're typing fast, tabbing would be faster. So if you do, not faster, but tabbing would help to speed up that input. Because if tabbing doesn't work properly, because tab indexes are not sorted out, right, then it's going to slow somebody massively. So if tabbing is supported, well, you will probably save at least, what was that? At least 10 seconds in that particular case for an 8-field address form. And we also need to avoid switching keyboard and mouse. Now, why do we do that most of the time? On when do we enforce somebody to switch between them? Well, most of the time when we have very, very tiny targets that are impossible to hit. I mean, people can use keyboard, hopefully, to navigate. If it's not possible, they will have to use a mouse for sure, right? But we also force people to interact with the mouse or with the trackpad whenever you have something like a slider or radio button or select drop-down or a toggle or anything like a checkbox or a button, right? People mostly stay on the keys when they're actually typing in data. So when it comes to birthday picker, it is much faster. It's going to be much faster to just have it as a plain input, right? And of course, not to forget, we need to invest in autofill, because with autofill, completion times are usually reduced by around 30% at least, if it's done correctly, right? Which brought me to this interesting idea of input budgets. So can we think about something like input budgets? We know all these things. We know that typing on mobile is slow. We know that changing input source is slow. We know that people actually change the input flow all the time. They might have made a mistake in the first place, so they kind of move to the other part and then they come back. They also very frequently overlook messages, error messages. We'll talk about it in a moment as well. And we also know that touch input is always faster and better than text input. So should we measure the completion time and the complexity of a form in a more objective way? For example, by saying, let's measure how many taps are required as a minimum to complete the form successfully. So if I give you the name, the right name, or you type in your name, right, and you don't make any single mistake, not a single mistake, everything is done properly, right, and autofill works and so on, how many taps will be required to fill in the form entirely? That's a very objective thing, right? I mean, it probably will depend, of course, on the user, but if you actually assume that that the user is not making any mistake at all, you're going to get to the point where you can actually evaluate the solution in a pretty good way. And we also can measure complexity by looking at how many input fields do we show at a given time as a maximum, right? So do you show like 10 steps or 10 input fields on the first step of your checkout, or 20 or 5 or 3? The smaller, usually the better, because it will be perceived a little bit better as well, right? So this gives us kind of a little bit of an input of how we can deal to evaluate if a design solution is good or not, and also map into the way of how people think about it. Now, on the other hand, we also need to think about input types. I mean, we have different options, right? And we should be using the right ones for the job. And this will be a little bit boring maybe, but I think it is very important, because when I think about a text box, if you happen to be on a pretty crappy display, be it mobile or tablet or desktop, you might have a pretty big problem actually figuring out what is a text box and what is not. So it would be useful, like for example in this case, if you have a little problem with the vision, you will not be able to fill in this form because you would not recognize it as a text box. So a text box needs to be, guess what? A text box. It needs a good padding. It needs to be bordered. It needs to have a large font size. I would say at least 18 pixels or so. Its width gives a clue of how much information is expected, right? We need to connect it properly associated with a label, and we need to think about placeholders as well. And we need to think about focus and active styles, because whenever people are using a tab, right, key. And we also need to think about autofocus, autofill, autocorrect, and capitalization, or lowercase if we want to, right? And probably remove things like that from password field or things like that. This can always go, like all of this combined can go in quite a long way. Now, we are used to this floating labels pattern. And floating label pattern has been even more pushed by the material design, right? And it has its issues. And I'm not saying that it is bad, because we're actually using it at Smashing as well. But it's a lot of work to get them done well, because we need to ensure that whenever things get localized, right, this label that we have changed, that we will change for another market, it doesn't get cropped on mobile, that it actually behaves properly. People have issues with it because you also cannot zoom in properly if you wanted to. You also end up with dense wrapping where sometimes you have only a few letters being kind of displayed. If you have the form where you have the label on the left and the text on the right, there are many issues. In general, it's probably the easiest and the most reliable way to actually have a top-aligned label. So you have a label on the top, below that you have the input field, and that's it. You will never get into any trouble. We had to do a lot of stuff like 2 or 3 years ago when we redesigned Smashing to get it right. And I see from the e-commerce work that I've been doing recently with an insurance company in Belgium, yes, just having a very simple top-aligned label above the input field performs way better than having input floating labels, which are sometimes misunderstood. Sometimes people think that they are placeholders, but they're not. Sometimes people think that they are hard to read because they're really light gray color and all. Frustrating and annoying. And very often they even act as placeholders, and as such they don't leave space for extra hints. So if you want to provide some hints for password or whatever, there is no place for it just because it's all embedded in one input field, and that can become a problem as well, right? Yes, and also there are some issues with screen readers that don't announce them and have long hint text may get cut off and things like that, right? There might be also a good conversation to have about should we mark only required field or only optional or both. Now, there are different studies saying slightly different things. In general, there is a very good quote by Adam Silver, who wrote a book on form design patterns for us. And he said that, we mark something in the interface to indicate it is different from the rest of the interface. Most fields in our forms should be required, and we probably have only a few optionals, if any. So we need to mark only optional fields. However, if you look into e-commerce research, you'll find out that for clarity, just to be able to reach a wide range of audience, we need to mark both required and optional. But in general, it's probably a really bad idea to mark only required. That's for sure. So it's either only optional or required and optional, at least in the context of e-commerce. Right. Now let's keep going. What else do we have instead of input fields? Well, we have radio buttons. I love a good radio buttons. Let's make a beautiful, nice, well-designed radio buttons because there is nothing wrong with them, right? The bigger, the better. The more interactive, the better as well. So radio buttons are great if they are round because they're expected to be round. Now, obviously, you can also have mutually exclusive options, not only for radio buttons that look like radio buttons, but also for larger boxes, right? So when we look into interface like this, for example, the first option is also a radio button. And if you look in the recipes per week, right, these two options essentially also radio buttons, right? It makes perfect sense. But in general, whenever you display a radio button as a radio button in a form, in a checkout or so, it's probably way better to actually just use that radio button there. But while radio buttons are round, checkboxes need to be squared. Can you tell me what is a little bit off in this design? Well, in fact, we have a checkbox which is disguised in a radio button, or the other way around. No, in fact, in this case, we actually have a checkbox which looks like a radio button, which it should not be. Because why? Well, because checkboxes should be squared, right? They're conventionally square. They're often tapped on mobile as well. And it's just a convention, so let's stick with it. I'm not trying to be this old person who's saying, oh, everything should be done this way. So, but this is a very general convention. So checkboxes are squared and radio buttons should be, radio buttony. And that makes perfect sense to me. But on the other hand, we also have our friend, the select dropdown, of course. Because again, when we look into the select dropdown, we need to think about what would be the right place and the right time to use it, or should it be, used this way at all? So when we look at open table, for example, right? Again, we have a very similar interface. There is nothing fancy going on here, right? Where we actually have the selection of the time, right? And then we have the selection of the number of people, and then boom, off we go, and we're done, right? So the question that I'm asking myself here is, so when we look into this, right? Is this select dropdown a good use of my time as a customer? Is this selection of the number of people, the select dropdown, a good use of my time as a customer? I'm not sure, because I think that in many ways, select dropdowns in that particular case, in those cases, will be much slower than anything else. They're painfully slow and often require way more effort than necessary. So we need to tap, then we need to scroll, and then we need to find, then we need to select the target, and then finally move on. In general, if we can avoid select dropdowns for something that would be just faster, we should probably do that. Whenever we can tap or click on a button, with switch, with a slider, with segmented controls, with button inputs, you're probably going to be better off than just having those select dropdowns in there, especially for things like country selector, which definitely needs to be an autocomplete, right? And I think in general, there is nothing wrong with just having buttons. I mean, I don't know about you, but I like good buttons. A big selection of many, many, many buttons. So what is wrong with them, right? I think that this is actually much nicer to actually show all those things instead of having a select drop-down that will actually, where you have to scroll all the way up and down to find what you're looking for, right? So maybe at some point, you can actually try to use one of those buttons instead. Now, all of those are kind of the common patterns that we will be using. So how can we then use them? Well, that's kind of where the idea of input boundaries comes from. And it's very similar to input profiling or like profiling a form. What the idea is actually, let's take a look at the form in detail and figure out what we do as we do it. And that means, let's figure out what a form does. So you have a designer and developer sitting together and having a conversation about what is supposed to happen. Right. So let's take a look at this form, a very boring B2B form, right? Nothing fancy going on here. You have a number of users in the top. You have payment methods, a selector, payment term, annually, quarterly, monthly, company, full name, email, phone, and so on and so forth. You could have the label appearing above the input field or, on the left. It could also change depending on where you place it, right? It looks okay, I guess. All right. So one would say, well, okay, so that's just the form. So what's a big deal, right? Nothing groundbreaking. Well, if we actually start diving deeper, we'll find out that there are plenty of things that can go wrong. Some input can be very complex. Some input can be non-forgiving. You might be typing in, a date in a particular format, in particular spaces or anything, and it's not supported, right? Layout could be confusing. Account creation might be required. You might have poor performance, poor support for autofill, poor validation with regular expressions, poor error messages, data editing, slow typing, data loss, validators that are way too aggressive and they don't accept your address, sudden unannounced changes in the interface, labels that disappear, poor IP geo-targeting, autocomplete, tabbing flows, no support for back button, and it just keeps going and going and going. So when we're looking into this, and actually this is coming from, this example is coming from a very, very good series of articles published on UX Planet by DKO agency, so you can look into it. But the idea is very simple. Let's look at the form and figure out what we do here. And let's start from top to finish. Designer, developer sitting together trying to figure this out. And this goes like this. All right, so in the beginning, we have what? We have the company. Now, what does it mean? Well, it means we need to think about what that field needs to do. Is it required? Yes, it's mandatory. Do we want to pre-fill it with autocomplete? Yes, we do. What kind of characters do we allow? Any characters can be allowed for company. Do we want to use something like adaptive placeholders? You see it quite often in B2B, whenever you have, let's say, you're selling car parts, right, to the US, let's say. You'll probably use a placeholder, e.g. Ford, for the company name. But when it comes to selling to Tokyo, to Japan, for example, you might have something like Nissan or so in there. Just an idea. We can use it and we can not use it. Minimum length. Okay, maybe 2 characters. Right, maximum length. Should we have a maximum? We probably need to because of the backend. So maybe 100 characters, maybe 60 characters. Just a decision that you need to have. Very simple, nothing groundbreaking. It gets a little bit complicated as you actually move forward. We have then a full name. We do the same thing. Required, pre-fill if applicable. We want to support this idea of solid single entity. This is how people perceive for the name, right? So we will avoid any kind of mistakes there. Alphabetic and space, hyphen, dot, minimum length 3 characters, maximum length 70 characters. Maybe something like that would be as well useful. The dot is necessary, by the way, just because you might have people with junior and other things, and it will probably depend on the audience you are targeting. And you keep going. Then you have the same for email, right, which is kind of the same, right? And then you have the same for the phone number, right, where you actually keep going a bit further. You have auto formatting here in place as well. Masking. You also need to make sure that you have an accessible tooltip or hint. All those things can be discussed between designer and developer before you actually prototype a form, right? And then it gets a little bit more complicated, which is where it's getting also interesting. Just a few more examples here to kind of indicate the point. You have the country selection. right? And that country selection usually looks like this, but it could also be more useful, right? Where you have an autocomplete when you start typing, then it gives you a selection of what you're actually looking at. But whenever you type something, let's say one character or 3 characters or united, you probably need to have some weights for different countries. So if you know that most of your customers are coming from the US, you probably want to show United States first prior to United Arab Emirates, right? But beyond that, you might want to do something else as well. Namely, when somebody just hits that input field, right, we probably want to show the options that are frequently used and also everything else in an alphabetical list, right? And whenever you have United Kingdom at the top as frequently used, you probably want to have United Kingdom at the bottom as well in an alphabetical list too, because some people might just scroll over and then overlook things, right? But then we also need to think about the size, specifically the height of this overlay, right? And what it's going to look like. And we need to ensure that it has a fixed height of an uneven number of cells. Why? Well, because we want to make sure that people do not mislead and don't get misled by the fact that, let's say, one of the countries happens to be on the last, like islands over there, and then you see nothing else, so you might be thinking that this is it. They might be scrolling down and actually landing in an area where you end up with a country like starting with the U, and you might think that yours is not there or so. Right? So you can think about this in fine detail. Fixed height of 7.5 cells, frequently used, alphabetical list. Do we want to support manual input and selection? So if somebody is typing in something and they're certain that they're right, do we want to let it through and then manually check it, right, if something goes wrong? Right? All those things kind of need to be considered. And then we can also go deeper, right? Detection by IP. Do we want to use geodetection to figure out what is used or not? Do we want to support kind of show something on focus, or do we want to let people be just typing a few characters first? Do we want to accept abbreviations for GB or UK, or do we expect something very, very stringent, right, like United Kingdom or Great Britain? Validation, and then also upon selection, it's probably reasonable to move to zip code. And then the selection of the country will have a dramatic impact and change the UI. How? Well, I'm glad that you asked, because you can localize the form based on the country input alone massively. You can change the currency, the wording on labels, the spelling on buttons, formatting on dates, times, input masking, text hints, zip code or postal code, city, state, or city, county. The logic could be changed as well. Placeholders, masking, input fields width, VAT calculation and taxes, and of course also legal requirements, GDPR, CCPA, or things like that. Mostly just because, whenever you happen to be from the US, the exception being California, of course, you may actually opt in the customer to sign up for your email newsletter automatically, but you cannot do that in Europe, right? So if you know that somebody is coming from European Union, you need to uncheck it, right? So all those things kind of can be considered. And all of this kind of keeps going. So you just keep going and keep doing the same thing over and over and over until you actually get to the point where you feel like, okay, now we know what we're doing. And so what I do is really taking all of those things that I have here, and I have a much bigger checklist that I will share with you as well, and I just have a conversation. We just sit down and have a huge conversation, because forms are complicated. They're not simple. They're not trivial. Getting a form right takes a while, right? And that most of the time requires you to think twice about one particular detail. And that would be how to deal with errors and typos. And that's kind of the last thing I want to highlight today. Because when it comes to typos, they are inevitable. They will come up. They will show up, and we have to fix them. So whenever things go wrong, we need to explain what actually happened. And we have a couple of ways of doing this. One of the typical things that we were using for a while was inline validation. And there are, in fact, 3 different kinds of inline validation. The premature one, imagine you just click on the input focus, right? And then the interface tells you, oh, that's wrong, you're doing things wrong. Well, I haven't even had a chance to actually type in anything. So let me be for a while, right? Before you actually give me errors. Then you have immediate validation. As users start typing, after a certain threshold, we can actually start validating. That's a more typical one. But the even more typical one is late validation, when the user leaves the field, on blur event happens, and then we actually show that there was a mistake. But all of those options interrupt users either too early or too late. So we have to be a little bit more strategic about this. And in fact, there is a way of doing this, and this is a little bit complicated, but it actually works fairly well. And it's called the reward early, punish late pattern, where for every single input that you have in an input field, you set a minimum threshold of characters after which you start validating. Now, if there is an error, you show it immediately as it's detected. So if there is a, let's say, 2 add characters, you show, in an email field, input field, you show an error right away, right? However, you show success, right, the green check mark, only if the user has moved to the next field on blur event. Now, the interesting thing is what happens when somebody decides to edit a field that was valid previously. Now, in that case, we validate only once the customer has left the input field. So if you edit a field that was valid already, well, we assume that you want to kind of adjust things, but the structure of that input is correct. So we're going to validate once again, but once the actual data entry is finished for that input field, because you might be very, very likely to remove something like @ symbol, to retype things or overtype things. However, whenever you edit a field that was invalid, right, where we had shown a mistake, we want to validate during data entry. So if there is an @ symbol missing, right, and somebody adds the input @ symbol, we want to validate right away without showing the hanging error message instead. So this is why we reward early, right, and we punish late. So if there was a mistake that's coming in, you will be displaying it once the person has left the input field. But whenever the mistake is corrected, you reward early and you show the actual success right away, right? And that's actually what we've been using as well on Smashing, and it was actually, very, very promising. But we also need to do a little bit more, because we need to display the summary of a problem as well. And so, or like just highlight those things. I mean, obviously, if we're using inline validation, we should be displaying and communicating the problems right away anyway. But it's still possible that people, especially in complicated corporate forms, people will just be overlooking them. So whenever you have a problem, whenever you have something that's wrong, this should be probably the ideal way of designing it. Again, when we look into this, you have a label. Under the label, you have explanation of what you expected. Here, a password and the description, right? And then the error message is appearing above the input field, not below it. Very important, because on mobile, people might be able to not just they might just overlook that error message if it's displayed below the input field. And I would probably also highlight the entire input in red, by the way, as well, right? And then, of course, this is probably what it's going to look like, right? So whenever you type, and we type the password, right? If there is a mistake or so, we are going to display it at the top in a summary and also in the above the input field as well, right? Also, you can do something else. You can also, if it takes a while for you to go back from the backend and get information from there, you can also request show that there are some errors by changing, like Facebook did a while ago. I think it still does, maybe, in the title, that there are still errors there, so it kind of requires your attention. And as somebody clicks on submit, right, it might be a good idea to highlight that there are errors when you click on things, right? So you need to fix one error, and it probably should be appearing above the button, not below it, right? So when you tap on it, right, whenever there are errors, you can actually drive somebody to those errors, right? Also, one interesting thing that is actually happening, and it's actually quite common, is to have disabled submit buttons. We've seen this a couple of times. So when you look at the bottom right here, right, we see that continue to card details is blocked because the input hasn't been provided successfully yet. It has become a popular pattern, but there is a problem with it. And the problem is that the disabled button doesn't really communicate what is wrong. It just communicates that something is wrong and you cannot proceed. And you will have some people who will be locked out, will be locked out and will not be able to proceed. So one thing that we decided to do in an insurance company website is to actually add a simple link. Just add the link at the bottom saying, help, I cannot proceed. Once you click on that link, right, under the button, it will get the information that you have typed in already. It will submit it all to the server, well, to the customer support. So the customer support has a chance to gain back that customer, right, or to get that customer, because otherwise they will abandon, and you will guarantee 100% abandonment if somebody cannot continue, right? In general, it's a good idea to avoid disabled submit buttons just because they do not communicate anything. They don't explain what's wrong, and sometimes users are left wondering what is actually missing. They're also not focusable and hard to read as they are grayed out most of the time. With enabled buttons, we have a chance and opportunity to better highlight all the errors, but that requires us to kind of know what the errors are. So instead of providing some generic errors, we need to be more specific. We need to be more helpful and create adaptive messages, error messages. And so this would take time because I need to communicate with the backend and see what is actually coming through, and then rewarded properly so customers understand what is going on. But this is a very, very significant thing. If you want to improve your conversion, that's probably the first thing to start with really good error messages. Now, all of this were kind of just examples of how you can get web forms, done a bit better, right? I could go on forever about forms. I'm just way too passionate and way too obsessed with forms. But just to wrap up here, essentially, when we think about forms, we need to think about how people think about forms and actually use speed, the number of taps, number of clicks required to actually fill in a form to judge if a design is good or not. Input budgets are always a good idea to measure how good a design is. You can always prefer large buttons, toggle sliders, and autocomplete, right? Input is fine as long as it's predictable. It's not needed most of the time to force people into going and, using a complicated widget to type in the birthday, right? Just a simple input would be good enough in many cases. Top-aligned labels always work fine. I didn't mention that, but in general, if you think about multi-page checkout or multi-page form or one single-page form, I could never find any studies that prove that one is always better than the other. It's about the amount of input fields that you're displaying at a given time. So I would never highlight or show more than 6 or 7 input fields at a time, but they need to be structured logically. So if you have an address form, obviously, you cannot just put one of the the apartment number on the second step, right? But they need to be structured well. In general, the less fields you show at a given time, the better, the fewer. Inline validation, use threshold, reward early, punish late, actionable errors, and error summary above the input. And also, we haven't mentioned that, but two-factor authentication has becoming kind of a normal thing at this point, and Magic Link as well. But we still need email and password because that's what people are used to. So when we look now back into the world in which everything is wonderful and shiny and beautiful, moving away from this idea of things being just horrible where people just get frustrated all the time, what would be a great experience today? Well, that's what people are excited about. Fast, accessible experience, large legible text, large checkboxes and radio buttons, input boxes that look like input boxes, full support for focus and active states, simple password requirements, predictable tabbing, helpful error messages, smart autocomplete, user input that's persistent on refresh. So whenever you hit refresh, the data is still there. Dropdown that's going to be opening on tap and click and not on hover. Although for e-commerce setting, you'll be probably using hover most of the time because you want to expose customers to many products. Easy undos, edits cancellation, predictable back button, snoozing notifications, pausing subscriptions. Very often you can either cancel or continue paying. But what if you want to pause for, let's say, a month or 2 or 5, right? And transparent pricing. That's what people appreciate, and that's what people like. And I hope that we can make those designs that we're designing every day a little bit better with just a few hints that I try to highlight over here. Now, with this in mind, I do hope that this was useful, and I do hope that you like cats, because I do have plenty of cats for you available, and I'm sure that Maxim will ask me for more. If you need to reach me on Twitter, Smashing Mag, if you want to read articles on UX or anything Smashing Magazine, we also have workshops and conferences on smashingconf.com. And if you go to this URL, you will find a checklist with all the things that I ask when it comes to forms. I don't know, I just skipped over that. I need to show it. Hold on, just a second. A very complete set of questions I'm asking when it comes to forms. Hold on, I just have to find it very, very quickly because it just jumped and it's not supposed to be like that. So if you want to take a screenshot, your time to do so will be, damn it, can't find it anymore, but I will. And I will head it to give it to Maxim to give away to you. I don't think I can find it now. Very confusing. Oh, here we go. Here we go. So every single question that I asked about web forms when we start working on anything related to forms, 11 plus 11 plus, well, it's 75. So I'm just going to quickly show it. And I think it's going to be on the video anyway, and I'm going to share the slides with you as well, so you can go ahead and use them right away. 75 questions to ask about forms. With this in mind, thank you so much for your attention. I hope this was useful. I'm open to your questions.
Thank you very much, Vitaly. It's amazing. It's just
my pleasure.
And I had some questions during your presentations, but you answered all of them.
Damn it! I didn't try to. I was trying not to, frankly, but that's okay.
No, it's fine, and I believe it's the same with a majority of our attendees. And yeah, we have a question. I see this from
Nils, right?
Kevin. Yeah, you can just read it because you see the comments also.
Sure. So Niels is wondering, you had in your slide that dropdown should at least have a height of 7.5 cells. What do you mean by 7.5 cells? Well, the thing is that we want to avoid the situation where sometimes you actually open that dropdown, but then one of the options is kind of docking, covering the end of that dropdown. So you might be thinking that this is it, that this is the entire selection. So you have, if you have, let's say, 55 products, but you show only 5. Right? Just because you have this last line ending in exactly the same spot where the dropdown ends, then you might have some people who will not scroll down. They will not know that there are more items in there. So whenever you add a bit of padding, right? So instead of having like 7 cells, or 7 options, you have 7.5, kind of showing an indicator that there is something in there. You will avoid the situations where people don't know that there are more and they can scroll.
Yeah, we have more questions from Sarah.
Yes, should be partly visible. You're absolutely right, Niels. Sarah is wondering about design for radio buttons versus checkboxes. It's important that these have the expected shapes, not only because of design conventions, but because they have different keyboard interaction patterns. Absolutely, totally right. And this is indeed a violation of WCAG. Sarah is on fire today. I can't tell you.
Yes, we have more questions.
Christian, any cases where you think multi-column input is okay? Yes, in very complicated, very corporate, very enterprisey forms. So I was speaking with a colleague of mine. They had an incredibly complex form and they had tons of columns because otherwise it would be just tons of pages. So if you do that, that is fine. However, it's very, very important that we actually space them out. So if you have first column and second column, if they're close, people might be expecting that they would click tab and they would move to the second column, right? If you space them out properly, right, you will be actually knowing that, okay, I need to fill in this part and then this part and then this part, right? Kind of need to make it predictable for them that they are navigating in that pattern, like from top to bottom and then to the next one, top to bottom, rather than actually going back and forth.
Yeah, folks, thanks for your questions. I believe we have time to have a couple more, so keep them coming, please. But meanwhile, I just want to remind about the workshops. We have special discount from Vitaly and the Smash Magazine on. And as promised, this is the link, short URL for a direct page with workshop descriptions and pricing and dates and everything. And if you've seen on the comments, I tried to post some summary of the workshops, but multi-line comments is not working very, very, very good. So it's just split it into 2. But I hope you'll understand the core. So the nearest workshop is 5 days one, from January 21st to February 5th. 5 days by 2.5 hours each. So this is super extensive one. And the second one is end of March 30-31, dedicated to building perfect navigation. So it's like forms.
Just the navigation,
like forms, but navigation. So
so we'll be looking at a lot of stuff like multi-level navigation, and we have a lot of nested levels. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with Hamburg icons? How do you deal with search? How do you deal with filters and sorting, and all these things? It sounds very boring. Oh, it's very exciting. It's extremely exciting, actually. I mean, navigation is everywhere, so we better get them right. Just like forms. Forms are also very important.
I can imagine.
I'm trying to dedicate my life to things that are important in life, like forms and checkboxes and stuff.
Yeah, and navigation is 5 hours workshop split into 2 evenings, and I believe both workshops are in evenings for
Yes.
European time zone, right?
Yes. So we always run them starting from 6 p.m. Central European time. And the way we do this, and this has been really, really exciting because it's, we cannot compete with big companies like Skillshare and Udemy and Pluralsight and so on, and we don't want to. Instead, we compete for something else. Do you know what that is, Maxim?
No idea.
No, we compete for broken, noisy pixels and audio issues and everything that's happening live, because everything is live. So it's kind of fully interactive. So we encourage everybody to turn on the camera and actually interact and speak up using the microphone and share their screen. And it's really, really fully. It's a lot of fun. It's great. And we also space it out just so you have time to actually consume the content, do something on your own. You also get homework. I like assigning homework to people. Like, it's cool. I think it could be a really bad t-shirt someday, maybe. Really annoying one. And so you actually have an opportunity to actually let it all dive in and sink in, and then ask any questions as you like, right? Because you have 5 sessions where you can ask questions. And so that's exciting.
Cool. Yeah, and thank you very much, Vitaly, for the special discount code you set for us. It's called Snow in Norway, so it's very personal for the country where Framsia comes from. And we have one more question from Nils Øvind.
Yes, Nils, you mentioned you'd share the presentation slides. Where will you put it? Also, thanks for, you're very kind. Too short. I'll do my best next time. But I'll be happy to, I'll be uploading the slides and I'll be sending them to Maxim, and then Maxim can do whatever you want with them.
Yes, and what I will do, I will send follow-up email to all members of Framsia, where I remind about the workshops, and I will share link to this recording on YouTube. Of course, this session will stay on YouTube, because definitely you will want to rewatch it one more time, 2 more time, to show it to your team, to show it to your boss, to show it to your customer, client, because it's full of amazing insights. So definitely, yes, you'll have all the access to both slides and the session and everything.
Excellent. Maxim, what are you going to eat tonight? Do you have any plans for dinner?
Yes, I will have tuna fish.
Of course, what a big surprise! You and your tuna. It's always this thing. Wondering, like, maybe we should ask her.
Actually, we have even more Norwegian fish. Of course, it's salmon. So let's say tuna is number maybe 3 after salmon, cod, and then tuna.
Okay, so maybe I would like to ask our dear friends who are joining us today. So, what do you think I should eat today? I have no idea at this point. I mean, I have some fish in the refrigerator. I do have salmon.
Folks, let's send some very Norwegian recipes to.
Yes, I would love that. So maybe I can then share a photo of what it turned out to be. But please, keep in mind that my level of hungriness is somewhere between, on a scale from 1 to 10, I would say it's around 8. Whoa, so if it takes like 2 hours to cook, maybe something a little bit quicker would be better.
So I believe folks are Googling cool recipes.
So probably,
maybe it's time to wrap up. I really don't want to keep you for too long, Vitaly. If you're that hungry, level 8, maybe level 9. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Maxim, and thanks everyone for joining in as well. I would love to see you all in person one day. I think we'll get there soon. In the meantime, we had this opportunity of online stuff, and thanks to Maxim, and you, of course, all for coming. We actually have this, which is, I think, also pretty decent, pretty great.
Yeah, and I wanted to share this story or history in the beginning of the event, but of course forgot. Actually, you know what, folks? If you have heard about Mobile Aero Conference in Norway, so yeah, if you live in Norway, I hope you heard about this. And actually, this conference was heavily inspired by Vitaly. Many years ago, I met Vitaly at one random conference somewhere in Europe, and I was so amazed by his session. So I came to him right after his talk and introduced myself and told, "Hey, Vitaly, I'm running mobile meetup here in Oslo, and I plan to start full-scale conference." I was in very early stage of planning everything. "If I do this, will you come to hold a keynote for this conference?" Vitaly answered, "Yes, bam, in 2016 Mobile Era Conference was born.
Oh, that was a great conference as well.
At the conference. So yes, thanks for this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Maxim. I mean, you were doing all the hard work. I'm just saying yes to people. That's not that difficult, I think. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for having me. And if you have some recommendations for Norwegian cuisine, let me know. I'll be looking out for that on the chat in YouTube still. So maybe in the future, like we'll drop by the video like a year from now, and then you see all the links coming in, and be like, oh,
yeah.
that's great.
Let's send a couple of very special Norwegian fish dishes. We have some of them, so you'll.
Oh, I'm not surprised at all. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and Maxim, thanks so much for having me, and see you next time.
See you, Vitaly.
See you. Bye.
And while we have some more folks online, let me remind about a couple more things. Folks, we really want to have more speakers from Norway at Framsia meetups, events online these days, and physical right after it becomes possible. This is why we have call for papers. It's just a simple form, and if you wish to present something for some dozens, if not 100 of attendees, just fill in the form or ping me on Twitter or contact me by any other way, and yeah, I will send you a follow-up email after this event, and let's stay in touch. Have a great evening. Thanks for being with us, and see you on the next event by Framsia Online. Bye-bye, folks.